Welcome back. In this video, part 2 of our lecture on creating platform games, we've got the basic moving mechanics for our player object set. Now we're going to make the game more interesting by adding some monsters that the player needs to avoid or die, and we're going to add some collectibles that the player can pick up in order to gain points. For this video, I have uploaded a new version of our platform game. It's called Platform 3 Class, I think, but you will find it on the course Blackboard site in the lecture folder, and then look for the platform game videos, and you will also then see the file. Okay. In order to save some time, you don't need to build in everything, so I've already set up all of the sort of basic elements in this game, so we can focus on the new pieces, which are creating the events and actions for our monsters and the events and actions for our collectible items in the game. Let me walk through briefly what I've already put in here for you. We've got the same blocks that we used in the previous version, and we've got our player character for the sprites. We also have a new sprite called Death, which we'll show you how to use. And then we have a folder with our monster sprites. We've got a left and right monster, we've got a left and right flying monster, and then we have something called a marker, which I'll explain what that is in a few minutes. And finally, we've got a mushroom sprite. Main thing to notice about the mushroom sprite is that it consists of 10 sub-images with different versions of the mushroom, and we're going to use these different versions in our game. And I'll show you in just a moment how that's going to work as well. And we have a sprite is like an exit sign for our player to reach when they have made it through all of the challenging components of a given level. Okay. We also have brought in some sounds that you will use for our monsters and collecting mushrooms and finishing the level and dying. And we've got some objects. We still have our player object, our block objects. Now we have a new marker object that I'll explain in just a minute. We have a dead monster object. We're going to set up our game so that the player can jump on the head of a monster, just like in Mario, to kill it. A mushroom object, a level exit object, and a death object. I've included all of these objects because they don't actually do much. The monster object just sets an alarm clock, and then when it goes off it kills itself. And the mushroom object selects one of the sub-images. It's got a create event, and then when the mushroom is created in the room, it will select at random one of those 10 sub-images. That's what we're saying right here. So create a sprite, the mushroom sprite, choose at random one of the 10 sub-images. That's how we'll have different versions of the mushroom show up in the room. Our level exit sprite doesn't do anything, just sits there. Our death object doesn't do anything, it just sits there. And our marker object also doesn't do anything, it just sits there. You'll notice too that it's not solid. The death object isn't solid either. Alright, so those are in there. You'll want to spend a little time just sort of looking through these objects, and of course you should be following along with the printed version of this lesson as it goes into much greater detail than I'm going into in these video demos. Alright, what we want to do is get into the fun part, which is creating our monster objects. So let's create those first. We're going to create a couple of them. One that walks on the ground and one that flies. So first I'm creating the one that walks on the ground. I'm calling it obj_monster. And I'm going into my monster folder, and I'm going to choose the monster right sprite. It's called Monster R sprite. Actually, it doesn't really matter which one you use, but we'll just use the version of the sprite that's facing to the right. Then I'm going to create an event, and it's going to be a create event, and I'm going to start our monster moving. Since we've got the right-facing version of the monster object selected, then I'll have him move off to the right as soon as he appears in the room. And I'll set a speed of 4. You, of course, are welcome to set the speed to be whatever you like. The faster the monster moves, the harder the level is. I'm going to choose a step event, and I'm going to do an end event step. And we've talked a bit about the timing of these different events. End event is useful as it's sort of the last thing that will happen before the sprites get drawn on the screen. And so you can set everything up, and you can have the game check collisions and do all of that sort of checking, and then you do an end step as a final sort of set of things to happen before the sprites get drawn on the screen. For our end step event for our monster, what we're going to do is check whether or not the monster is moving to the right or moving to the left. And I'll show you how we can do that. We're going to come down to the control section, and we're going to check a variable. And the variable that we're going to check is the horizontal speed, which is just called h speed. And we're going to see if the horizontal speed is larger than 0. Now, think about what this means. If the horizontal speed is larger than 0, it means our monster object is moving to the right. And if the horizontal speed is less than 0, it means the monster object is moving to the left. So here we're checking to see if the monster object is moving to the right. And if the monster object is moving to the right, then we're going to make sure we're showing the right-facing sprite. So we're going to choose monster right sprite and leave everything else the same. Well, what if it's not moving to the right? Then it's going to be moving to the left. So we'll include an else statement, and we'll change our sprite to the one that faces left, monster left sprite. That's it for our step events. Now we need to have some collisions. We need to know, for example, when our monster collides with a block. And block basically are the walls and the platforms inside our level. In this case, because the monster is going to be moving left and right horizontally, if it collides with a block, we want it to turn around and move the other way. So we're going to select move and reverse horizontal. We also need to know if our monster collides with a marker. Now, the way markers are going to work, these are going to be objects sort of like our blocks. You know, we use our blocks as we lay out our room, but when we play the game, they are invisible. We don't really see them, but we can still collide with them. Marker is going to be the same thing. We can actually detect when our monster collides with a marker, even though the marker is not a solid object. And what do we want to have happen? We're going to do the same thing. We're going to reverse direction when we collide with a marker. What we're going to use these markers for is a way of determining the left and right sort of barriers to movement for our monsters, so that if we have a short horizontal platform in our game, and we want the monster to move back and forth on that platform, well, we can use these markers as a way to show where the left extreme is and where the right extreme is. That's all we need for our monster. We can go now very easily and create the other monster, which is going to be our flying monster. And instead of starting from scratch, it's going to be almost the same in terms of its functionality to our current monster. So I'm going to right-click on the current one, and I'll choose Duplicate. And I'll name this one obj_flyer. And for the sprite, I'll come down to the monster folder, and I'll choose the right moving monster, sprite, the flying one. And for our create, we're still going to be moving off to the right, but let's set a different speed. I'll make it just slightly slower. And then everything else is the same. We've got our same step event, except now we need to make sure that we change the sprite from the walking monster to the flying monster. And then our collision with the block and collision with the marker are both the same. So very quickly we've got a couple of monsters. Be sure to save your program, and we can now take a look and see what this looks like with our monsters in place. So in order to test this out, let's take a look at our room. I've got it open here, and I've actually turned off the grid so we can just see what the room itself looks like a little easier. And you'll notice that I've already placed some of our marker objects. And these, again, are going to define the range of movement for our monsters. So you can see on this platform, I've got one on the left and right. So if I select my monster object and I click up here on this platform, then when we play the game, it'll only go to here and then it'll go to here. I can stick one down here as well. Here I've got the wall to block it on one side and then the marker to block it on the other side. We could do the same thing for our flying monster. Up here we only have one, so it'll go all the way here and go off the edge of the screen, come out back over here, and then turn around again. And I'll put one right here. In this room, you'll notice that we already have our level object and we've got our mushroom objects. We haven't actually set up the mushroom objects yet, so they won't do anything yet. But that's okay. We can take a look and see how it's working for us. All right, here's our room. We've got our little guys moving back and forth quickly. And my guy comes over, he runs into him. We haven't set up a death yet, so he can run into them with impunity. So now we need to come back into our game file, and we need to set up our player object so that when it collides with one of the monsters from the side, then the player will die. And we're going to do something cool, which works, you'll see in a lot of platform games, where if our player lands on a monster from above, then the monster will be killed and the player will get some points. So let's do that now. Open up your player object. Right now, everything that the player is doing, we've set up previously in the previous video. So we're just going to move on from what's here and add a collision event with our monster. And we'll do the walking monster first. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to run a check to see if the player is colliding with the monster from above. And here's how we can do that. We're going to do a test expression action. And what we're going to test is a couple of pieces of information at the same time need to be true in order for us to say that the player is landing on top of a monster so that the player can get some points. First of all, we're going to check whether or not the player is falling rather than walking. And the way we can do that is by checking the vertical speed of our player object. If the vertical speed of the player object is more than 0, that means the player is falling down toward the ground. And we're also going to check whether the Y position of the player object is less than the Y position of the monster object plus some pixels, in this case 8. What that is doing is it's making sure that our player object is indeed both falling and is above the monster object. Now, assuming both of those things are true, then we're going to be able to kill our monster and give the player some points. So it's a fairly complicated relative to what we've done in the past, set of actions. So I'm going to make sure to comment it so that I know what's going on. So I'm going to say, destroy monster, and give points. You're actually doing more than that, but that gives the general key things that we're going to do. So if we really are killing the monster, then I'm going to go ahead and play a victory sound. So I'll choose play sound, and I'm going to choose the sound kill monster. Remember, these sounds are already inside your game file, so you don't have to import them. And setting the loop to false. Then we're going to give our player some points. We'll add 50 points to their current score. Then what we want to do is we want to stop the player from moving. So let's do that next. We'll do a start fixed move, but we're setting it to not moving at all. And of course, if we're not moving at all, we need to have the speed to 0. And just to clarify, we're not stopping the player. The player is sort of falling down toward the ground. And if the player collides with the monster, we want the player to continue moving until it hits the ground. But we need to stop our monster from moving since our monster is now dead. So in terms of applying this action, we want to apply it to other, meaning apply it to the monster. Then we're going to change the instance from the monster that's racing around trying to kill the player to the dead monster object, which has been created for you already in the program. So let's choose from the main 1 tab our change instance, and then we're going to select other, so we're changing the instance of the monster. And we're changing it into the dead monster. And the dead monster has some events associated with it, so we want to run those events. So we're going to say perform events, yes. Just briefly before we move on to create the next set of events here, I want to show you what's happening with this dead monster object, just as a reminder. So we've got our dead monster object. All that's going to happen is that it's going to show up on the screen. It's going to set an alarm for a very short period of time. After that period of time passes, it's going to destroy itself. All right, coming back into our set of actions, we need to have an end of block so that all of these actions will all work. Now we need to have an else. So what happens if this isn't true? What happens if we have a collision between the player and the monster, but the player isn't falling down from above and killing the monster? Well, in that case, we need to kill off the poor player. So we'll start another start of block, and we'll put in a little comment to remind ourselves what we're doing. We'll say destroy the player. Here we'll have another sad sound for this one. So we'll choose a sound to kill character. Oh. And we're going to give our player just a moment to notice that he suffered defeat. So we'll set a sleep event for just for a second. And then what we're going to do is we're going to restart the current room. And you can put an effect or not. I'm not going to. It gets a little irritating to the player after a while if they have to wait for an effect each time they die and the room restarts. So I'll just say no for mine. And then I'll be sure to have my end of block. Okay, so that's all we need for that monster, I believe. We can save our work at this point and test it to see if it's working the way we want. Alright, now we've got our monsters moving back and forth. If I run into this guy, oh, my poor guy dies and he disappears. So let's see if I can jump on top of our little guy here. It's a tough one to get to. Alright, if I jump on top of him, we get a nice sound, we get the brief moment of seeing the squished monster, and then the monster dies, and we get some points. Everything's working just the way we like. Now let's do a similar thing with our flying monster. So, still with your character object open, create another collision event, this time with the flying monster. And the actions for this are going to be a lot simpler than they are for the walking monster. We're going to set up the flyer so that you can't actually jump on top of it. No, you really could, but we're not going to set it up that way for this one. Instead, we're going to set it up so that the flyer can only kill the player. So we'll play our sad kill character sound. We'll sleep for a second. And we'll restart the current room. Alright, so far, so good. Next, staying with our character object, let's create a collision event that is a positive one, where the player collects one of the mushrooms in the room and gains some points. So I'm going to add a collision event, and I'm going to select object mushroom. And we'll give a nice sound effect. If the player runs into a mushroom, we'll choose sound get mushroom. And we're going to give our player some points for collecting that mushroom. I'll just set it to 10. Make sure to hit relative so you don't wipe out all the points but 10, but add 10 points to the current score. And then we will destroy the other object, meaning if the player runs into the mushroom, we don't want to destroy the player, we want to destroy the mushroom. And that's all we need to do for our mushroom. Next, if you remember in our room, we already have our mushrooms laid out, so we've just set them up so that they'll work. We also have a level exit, which marks the end of our level. This achieving the ability to reach the exit, essentially. So let's set that up next. Coming back to our character object, we're going to create yet another collision event. This is going to be the collision with the level exit object. We'll play the finish level sound. We'll sleep for a second to let the player savor his or her victory. Then we're going to do a check. We're going to see if there's another room. So back here on the main 1 tab, we'll come down to the room section, and you can see there's a check for a previous room and check for a next room. So we're going to set it up to check if there is a next room, then we'll go to the next room. I'm going to use a start and end of block, even though we're actually only doing one event, just because I think it's neat. You can choose a transition event here. It's kind of a nice way to do it since the player has really achieved something. I'll just pick one at random. And then we're going to put in an else statement in case there isn't a next room. What if they finished all the rooms that exist? Well, then we're going to show them their score. And we're going to restart our game. And we'll close off our action. Alright. Let's do a quick check, and then we'll do one final piece. We're going to have this frightening death object. And I'll show you how that works after we check to make sure everything's working up to this point. Alright, we've got our little guy moving back and forth. He can collect mushrooms, and when he does, he gets some points. If he jumps on top of that guy, he gets some points and kills him. Oh, but if he gets hit by a monster, then he loses. And then I'll jump ahead and get to the exit so you can see how that works. I'll pretend as if only seconds have passed, although it actually took me a while. So here I am, close to the end of the level. When I hit it, there aren't any other rooms. I've only created this room, and so then I show the top 10 score table, and then I restart that game again. So everything's working the way we want it to. Let's do one last thing, which is to create an interaction with our death object. And to explain what the death object is, let's look again at our room. Let me turn off the Snap to. If you look over here, you'll see here are a series of our death objects laid out, one after the other. And what we've got here is basically a pit. So that if the player drops down into this pit, the player is going to die. All right, so you can think of it as quicksand or saw blades or nails or whatever. So let's set that up. Coming back to our player object, creating a new collision event, colliding with the death object. And what do we want to have happen? Play a sad sound, the kill character sound. Give the player a moment to recognize his or her defeat. And then we'll restart the current room. One last thing I'll show for this video demo, taken from the much longer and more detailed printed demo, is the use of views. It's often the case in a platform game that you don't see the entire level all at once on the screen. In this sample, we have a very small level to start with, so you don't really need to use views, but imagine that this were 3 times as long, for example. If it were, you might want to just look in on our player and just see the stuff that's around the player, and then you'd like the view to follow with the player as he or she is moving around on the screen. Thankfully, GameMaker makes that really easy to do. Let me show you how you do it. Open up our room and select the Views tab, and then choose Enable the Use of Views, and then select a view, View 0, and choose Visible when room starts. What we're going to do now is decide how much of a view we want to see around our player at a given moment in the game. I'm going to follow the printed tutorial by saying 300 by 200. Not seeing a whole lot of the game. To be honest, normally what you would do is choose a larger view, maybe 640 by 480, 800 by 600, and so on, showing a piece of a much larger room. In fact, in our course textbook, chapter 14 makes use of this for a very cool and large-scale game where you're moving through a pyramid. All right. There are other settings that go along with views here in terms of the port and the position, but since we're just going to be following the player, we don't have to mess with any of these. We only need to worry about the size of the view. Coming down to the bottom, however, we need to tell GameMaker which object to zoom in on and to follow around. Well, we're going to follow the character object. Then we can decide how much of a buffer around our player do we want to have at all times. I'll set that to 64 and 64. So no matter what the view is on screen, we're always going to have some space around our player in that view, so the player won't be close to the edge of the view. Then in terms of making the sort of scrolling of the view look smooth rather than being super fast, I'm going to set a speed, the horizontal maximum speed and the vertical maximum speed to 4. That will make for a nice, smooth scrolling to follow the player. Alright, let's take a look and see what that looks like. So here we are now. We've got a nice zoomed-in view. I can still play the game. And as I move along, the view moves along with me. You can see this makes the game can make the game more challenging too, because you can't see too far away what's coming up. So you've got to be extra careful with your jumps. Alright, in the printed version of the tutorial, there are some other cool elements that you could build into your game that we're not going to cover in this video. For example, there's a section on getting your player to move up and down ramps, and there's a section on creating a gun and enabling your player to shoot the monsters. So get in and play around as much as you can with this. Use the file that goes with this game to create your own cool platform game. I'll put the more complex version of the platformer game file up on the Blackboard site for you to mess around with and have fun with.